say, long-term care homes. Like, what are the main problems of long-term care? There's a guy named Bill Thomas who said that there are three plagues of the contemporary nursing home, and they have to do with loneliness and boredom and a lack of purpose.
So I'm here with proud founder and professor at the University of Waterloo, Andrew Stumpf. Good to be here. Lots of things going on in light of COVID, in light of news around long-term care homes. I think that the research and the work that we'll be doing is very pertinent to what you guys are seeing today.
Hopefully.
Yeah, hopefully. But lots to get through. So as a pilot, we have lots of introducing to do to get you guys on board to what we're doing, what this is about. But first, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, Dr. Stumpf?
Yeah, so a bit about myself. Well, I'm a philosophy professor here at St. Jerome's University and the University of Waterloo. I focus on ethics, but I'm kind of a generalist. In recent years, I've been starting to pay a lot more attention to end-of-life related issues. That comes out of a background in bioethics and tries to carry it into a more specific area that's particularly relevant and pertinent for us right now, as you've been noting with some of the things around end-of-life issues that we're facing. Not to mention the new legislation around medical assistance in dying that came in around 2015, 2016. So there's been an awful lot of things related to end-of-life care in the news and in the media.
So why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about what the Kernel project is, what is it about, and what are the goals of the project?
The Kernel project is a kind of hub or a connecting point for a number of different people from different spheres and domains in society, but mostly centered around the academy, researchers, students, but also healthcare professionals who have an academic interest or a research interest. And just to get these different groups and people connected with each other around a variety of different things, around educational resources, events that are happening, research projects that are being carried out, community partner initiatives, and to start just giving a forum for people to connect with one another about those things with a central theme around improving end-of-life care.
So when you talk about end-of-life care, a lot of that has to do and is related with the concept of dying. Mm-hmm. And even as I myself reflect around death and just a concept that, like, as humans, we all will pass away. Mm-hmm. Like, it's a very uncomfortable subject to broach. What is it about death that it is so challenging to approach, research, and talk about?
I mean, there's that thing about philosophers. So there is a philosopher named Hegel who had this theory that it's actually impossible for a person to think about their own death. Conceptually speaking, you can think about the deaths of other people, but when you try to think about your own death, there might be something just conceptually problematic about that with us. But just, I think beyond that, our culture prioritizes youth, flourishing, well-being, energy, vitality, beauty, and death and the end of life sort of represents the opposite of those things. And even though we're all going in that direction eventually, we don't want to think that way, and we're not really trained to think that way, and it kind of runs counter to a lot of the ways that we do approach our day-to-day life.
For the average person, right? Like, how do you think the research that you guys consolidate and the research that you guys are undertaking, how does it affect them in terms of, like, what are the outcomes, or what are some of the things that you're going to discover or even talk through?
So I mean, I'm basically a big fan of research being practical, that there almost always are practical implications of research that people do if you can kind of tease them out. In particular, though, I think just the fact that death and dying are a universal phenomenon, and that everybody is going to face that in their own life eventually, but long before that, in the lives of their loved ones, of grandparents, parents, aunts, uncles, other relatives, friends, and so it's worthwhile thinking for any person, how would I actually care for or support somebody who is reaching the end of life? How can I do that well? How can I be there for somebody who's dying because they have a terminal illness or whatever reason it might be. So I do think that this research that we're trying to do, where we're asking about improving end of life, we're asking about the human side, the care side of end of life issues, I think it's relevant to everybody in a very practical way. Just again, because everyone's going to go through that experience, and it would be better for anybody to go through it in a way that's equipped and informed, someone's knowledgeable about that area, than to be sort of ignorant and not really thinking about it until the last moment.
Right. So there's obviously a lot of uncertainty. No one's an expert on what happens after death, or like even there's not that much talk about, you know, while people are on their deathbeds, or you know, I think you've mentioned to me once that like the way people die is very unintentional. Like seldom do you hear like, okay, when I die there's going to be this process. And so I hope a lot of the work that you guys are doing will shine a light on that process. But what are some of the harder questions you think people are going to have to ask themselves as they encounter the work that's done in and with the Kernel project?
I think one of the areas of focus that I like to think a lot about is this thing called the ars moriendi, or the art of dying. And it's actually sort of a cumulative body of knowledge that was built up and crystallized in the Middle Ages, just actually right after the bubonic plague had, actually it was in the midst of the bubonic plague that was facing Europe. And the church at the time basically said, there are too many people dying. It's too difficult for the priests to actually go and minister to people who are dying. So we need to actually teach people, lay people, how to care for one another and how to sort of walk each other through the things that are needed at the end of life. And so a manual was put together, which has come down to us as the Ars Moriendi, Art of Dying. But actually that manual that was put together sparked a whole genre of literature that was in use all across Europe, all across North America, really up until, I would say, early to middle 20th century. This knowledge started to be lost when we started to gain more control over the dying process. And we started being able to keep people alive a lot longer than we used to. In the past, for the most part, you would get sick and you would be dead within a couple of weeks. And we just didn't have control over most disease processes. And now we're able to keep people alive sort of almost indefinitely. So as that started happening, and of course, as you're having more control over the dying process, you're getting people into hospitals and institutions, and that's where they're spending those final years of life, especially when you're highly dependent on medical knowledge and technology. You end up having to stay around hospitals quite a lot, and if you're not in a hospital, you're in some kind of place where you can receive intensive care. And those environments just are not the kind of place where you're going to encounter a lot of ability for people to be hospitable, to be focusing on sort of putting your spiritual house in order, walking through all of the relational things that are needed to die well, we might say, right, in the art of dying. So I think that's a really important dimension of this, is to really think about that. Like what is it about dying that would make it a good dying? What are the kind of things that need to be done in those last days and hours that you have on Earth?
Right.
And what do you want to get done before you go?
Right.
What are those kind of things? So I don't know if I don't think that really got at the other question that you had there, but I just felt like that's a really important area that I'm really excited about, is sort of recapturing how can we go back to some of the principles of that art of dying body of knowledge, and how can we apply that to our contemporary situation, where we face a very different situation because we do have this sort of prolonged end of life process and ability to keep people alive a lot longer. But how do we still make that body of knowledge applicable, and how do we learn to embody that in the way that we ourselves spend our dying moments, and how we walk each other through that process as well?
I think of a couple of things just about when you're speaking about a manual or intentional. I mean, there's little things that you talk about. There's things like life insurance. There's things like doing your will.
Yes,
there's
of course,
things like reconciling with your family. Like you kind of hear it in bits and pieces.
Yeah.
But for some reason, like when I think about all this stuff, like me being in my 20s, like I think about like this is an old person thing, or this is someone who has a chronic disease that's been given a timeline to live.
Right.
Like, is that the right way to be approaching it, or no? Like this is something everyone has to think about as part of being an adult, period.
Well, and really, you don't even have to be an adult. I mean, there's lots of literature around children that develop terminal illnesses, and what their parents have to go through in trying to care for them in the last moments. I mean, people can die at any time. People can die before they're born. People can die right after they're born. People can die anywhere along the spectrum. Of course, like thankfully, by and large, most of us end up living a decently long life, and we get several decades to go at it. But certainly people can die at any time. People can develop terminal illnesses at any age. Not only that, but people die, and how do we deal with things like drug overdoses and the opioid crisis? And these are things that affect younger people predominantly, right? So I mean, you've got your friends who are younger. How do you deal with their dying when that suddenly comes on, and how do you relate to them in the sometimes very brief chance that you might have? But
Right.
So no, I do think, and again, younger people, even though they might themselves have many decades to go, their grandparents certainly don't, and nor do any of their older family members, and you're just going to end up getting thrown into lots of situations where grandma is now reaching the end, and what are we doing about that as a family? How are we supporting her? How are we caring for her? And then eventually, when you get to my age, you start thinking about your parents, because now your parents are getting close to the age when, they're reaching sort of the average lifespan of human beings in this part of the world. And
I think about a couple of tailwinds that like make these questions even more urgent, right?
Okay.
We think of the retiring population, the biggest it's ever been,
Yes.
right? Like this is no secret. Whether you're in sociology, whether you're in economics, political science, we're studying this. It's kind of like a live experiment.
Yeah.
Another tailwind is just the idea that we just got hit by a pandemic, and like people are having to ask these questions at a faster pace. Right. And I mean, you taking this on, like you didn't even forecast the pandemic, like when you were thinking about doing this project early last year.
Right. Of course. I mean, the pandemic has brought to the attention of the public the importance of a number of things around end-of-life care.
Right.
But as you're also pointing to the aging population, the baby boomer generation, there's going to be more people alive on the earth and in societies who are over the age of 65 than there ever has been in history. We have never faced this in history before. And again, it goes back to some of these things about increasing medical technology, ability to keep people alive longer, and this kind of thing. But it also connects to people not having as many kids, perhaps, right? So the proportion of elderly people to younger people in societies is going to be dramatically different over the coming decades, next literally like 2 to 4 decades, than it ever has been. And this is I mean, many people have recognized this as a kind of looming crisis. People refer to it as the silver tsunami. So there have been people who are attentive to the importance of this from that side. But you're right that also when something like this hits, when we've got this COVID-19 pandemic across the earth, this brings to light some of the issues that, frankly, people who work in long-term care and who look into this kind of stuff have been saying for an awful long time about the need to reform our long-term care system and how do we improve these things. But yeah, right now, this really puts it on the map.
So what about this project excites you the most in terms of contributing to this very big endeavor?
Yeah, I think what gets me most excited, well, there's a lot of things that get me excited about this work, but I think one of the things that most inspires me is to see the way that people facing a challenge of, say, long-term care homes, like what are the main problems of long-term care? There's a guy named Bill Thomas who said that there are 3 plagues of the contemporary nursing home, and they have to do with loneliness and boredom and a lack of purpose.
Wow.
You know, and people who see that situation and who get past the initial response, which is like we're kind of disgusted or we're upset, we're angry, we're outraged, we're calling for reform, but who actually think, okay, how could we fundamentally make this better, and who then take the next step of coming up with actual creative solutions to do better. That gets me excited. It gets me excited too because I work with students who have a lot of energy, a lot of passion. They're at a stage of life when they're sort of just coming into their own as far as really thinking about things, and they've got a lot of passion, a lot of drive to change the world, to make a difference in the years that they have coming ahead. So there's a lot of potential there. So we're talking about things that get me excited about this work, and I was just going to share one great example, going back to Bill Thomas again, is he came into a nursing home and he was sort of put in charge of it, and one of the things that he decided to do was to bring animals into the nursing home, and not just 1 or 2 pets or something like that, but he brought in cats and dogs and birds, and there were birds in almost everybody's room, and just that one simple thing just totally brought people to life. It actually had a huge impact on health measures for the residents in that long-term care home, and it was because bringing life. Oh, he brought plants in too. He brought animals and plants.
Right.
But when people started to be surrounded by life in this way, and people started to find a purpose again in caring for the forms of life that were around them, this actually had an incredible measure on people's sense of well-being, but also on their general health outcomes, because people were really worried that you bring all these animals in, this is going to cause confusion and chaos. It's going to be problematic for health, and in fact, it was the opposite that was shown. Similarly, there's someone named Karen Brown Wilson. These are both examples, by the way, that Atul Gawande talks about in his book Being Mortal, which is a great book, highly recommend to anybody. But Karen Brown Wilson is a pioneer of the assisted living concept, and basically her idea was, why do we have to trade off freedom and autonomy for safety when people get toward the end of life? And what she was looking at was sort of institutional forms of living that were available tended to really curtail people's freedom, and that was a major concern for people. And so she was just asking the question, how could we design a way for people to live and still have as much freedom as we can possibly allow them, without compromising on safety issues?
Sure.
And just a fundamental thing, just as one example that she came up with, was like, hey, let's let people lock their own doors to their rooms, right? And that ability to say, this is my space, this is my home, and I have the right to let people into my space or not, as opposed to, say, living in an institution somewhere where the workers there can just kind of come and go into your room or out whenever they want to, and you don't really have a say over it. Well, that's not really your space anymore. You're not really able to call that a home. So a lot of these kind of ideas Karen Brown Wilson put into practice in her assisted living concept. And that's the kind of thing that gets me excited. I think there's a huge challenge facing us, and yet we don't have to give in to fear about that. I see it as an opportunity to do really great and wonderful things. Another example would be just referring to like dementia villages, where people are offering care to those who have advanced Alzheimer's, and just actually creating spaces that enable someone who's in that state to live a full and flourishing life as much as they can in the state of sort of declined capacity that they happen to be in. All that stuff makes me really excited. There's lots more examples, but I think to me that's the best, and that's probably a big part of what's behind the Kernel Project inspiration, is to try to connect people around the problems and challenges that are facing us and get inspiration and get the sort of creative juices flowing, get people talking to each other, and having an impact as a result to generate real meaningful positive change in this area, so that again we're not facing the end of life just sort of trying to catch our tails and everything catches us off guard and we don't know how to deal with it, but that we're actually ready and prepared, and that we can actually make this a great experience. I mean, to the extent that dying can be a great experience, why not make it as great as we can?